everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Dancing Professor. On today's episode, we're actually going to be talking about a really interesting form of UX methodology called eye tracking. And to help me talk about eye tracking is the master of eye tracking, my colleague Chris. Chris, would you introduce yourself to our viewers?
Sure. Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a UX researcher.
Awesome. And how long have you been doing UX research?
I've been doing UX research for, I don't know, probably 4 years now, maybe
Awesome.
5 years.
Awesome. And is eye tracking the only type of research you do, or do you do other kinds of research?
I do all sorts of research. Eye tracking is, I think, one thing on in a list of many.
Awesome. Awesome. Very cool. So, yes, before we actually continue talking about eye tracking, can you please explain to our viewers what eye tracking is?
Sure. So eye tracking is a method for that can be used for determining where somebody is looking at a given point in time.
And why would we care about where people are looking? What kind of research questions are usually answered with the use of an eye tracker?
Sure. So I'd say the most straightforward answer is really that you might care how people navigate a UI, user interface, or you might want to know things that are distracting to them. You can answer research questions that involve, like, say you're using a mobile app, the navigation of a certain feed, or how users look through a page, what things they're looking at, what things they're not looking at. You can also use this method kind of in conjunction with other methods to determine things like, are people noticing something? Attention can be a bit of a tricky subject with eye tracking, yeah. And so you don't want to necessarily jump to conclusions here, but you can use things like doing certain memory tasks to see if people are also remembering.
What they were looking at?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay,
so,
interesting.
With a combination of methods, you can kind of get a little bit closer to attention.
Okay, so let's say I've never seen an eye tracker before. What does it look like?
Sure.
What are the materials that go into it?
Well, you're in luck. We have an example of one here. This is a mobile eye tracker that has a pair of glasses that are maybe referred to as a head unit.
Okay.
A head unit, yes. And there's a recording unit down here that records the data. And there's a few points of data that it'll record. Most importantly, what you have on the front here is a camera.
Okay.
And this camera looks at whatever is in front of the person wearing these glasses.
Okay.
And then you also have these illuminators and sensors kind of on the inside, and they actually look up toward the person's eye who's wearing the glasses here. And kind of, in the basic way that it works is that the illuminators will kind of portray a pattern on the person's eyes, an invisible pattern. And then the sensors will read this pattern in order to interpret the direction that their eyes are looking.
Okay, got it.
And so you can kind of overlay these things, the video of what they're looking at, and then the angle of their eyes to kind of determine where they're looking in their field of view.
Latitude and longitude of what they're looking at. Okay.
Kind of like that.
But so may I
go for it.
Borrow it? So they look pretty clear though. So where do all these paths and how do you actually see what the people are looking at?
Sure, yeah. So this will be something that's then hooked up to a laptop such as this.
Okay.
And as the person is doing some sort of task that you've given them, you will be able to see what they're looking at through this camera here on the computer screen.
Okay, so this camera links to a computer screen, and we're seeing almost like through their eyes, right?
Yeah,
So they're like the director.
Yep.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah. I think that's a good example.
Okay.
You're kind of able to put yourself in the head of a user.
Okay, cool. So typically when we do UX research, right, we're always we're the third person, so we always are representing them in a third person perspective. But here we actually get to see what they see, so it's very first person. Yeah. That's awesome. Okay, and then what about the illuminators? Do you the paths that people see? Does that generate some sort of data?
Yeah. So the data that are generated in addition to this, so you kind of have those two layers that I mentioned before. You have the video layer, so you see what's kind of in their field of view,
right? And
then the actual layer of data of where in that field of view that they're looking. And so you can kind of map these things together into XY coordinates, like you mentioned, like latitude, longitude. And based on that, determine where they're looking and what else is on that image to say, okay, well, where did they look at that certain time? And you can kind of see, you can even track the paths over time where they might be looking.
Okay, so I imagine you mentioned something like attention is fragile, if you will, right? And so let's say you're in a usability study and you want someone to look at, I don't know, ads on a screen or something, right? And they're looking at it, but we get distracted really easily, right? And then oftentimes when people are looking at a device but you're in the room and they're talking to you, they will often look up at you, right? So does that just create like zigzag patterns, or like how do you know what data is relevant to keep and what data is not?
Yeah, so there are all sorts of ways to do the actual data processing. The kind of short answer to that is, you'd like to keep the tasks brief.
Okay.
To make sure
that helps.
Yeah,
okay,
to make sure it's confined to a specific goal.
Okay.
Maybe even like a minute or a couple minutes. Those generate, I think, oftentimes the most useful data. If a participant goes and gets distracted and moves their head and looks at something else, that will be a point where you actually don't want to use that data. You'll cut that data out from the analysis. Would be a typical way to handle that.
Okay. Okay, speaking of data analysis, so I know previously when we've talked about eye tracking together, you mentioned something called a heat map. So what is a heat map?
Cool. So a heat map is, I think, a more general type of visualization where you can kind of look at the aggregate of patterns, or where things most commonly are. And you'll see these as heat maps as images where there's kind of like a green that flows into maybe a darker yellow or orange to a red.
Maybe I could find an example of a heat map, so you could. I'm Googling Google, and I'm already on Google. Haha. Okay. Heat map. Images for eye tracking. Yeah, so let's say eye tracking. So which of these do you like
I think this is an easy example right here.
Okay.
So this is an example. It looks like a heat map kind of overlaid on some search engine results here. And
sorry, trying to make it bigger. Clearly I'm not succeeding. Okay, go ahead.
What this would likely be portraying is participants. Maybe you have 10 or 20 participants in aggregate, kind of where they're most commonly looking. And the most common places are going to be in the hotter colors.
The red zone.
The red zone,
okay.
Right? Here.
So here we see someone put in the search holiday villa in Spain. Okay, and so this represents that this is where most of the people were looking because it's most red.
Yeah, so it's hard to tell what the exact measure that they used here was. Maybe they're using things like number of fixations.
Fixation map. Duration-based trials, something.
Yeah, can't quite read
we can't really read that, but yeah.
This may be a number of fixations. So you have people fixating more often on kind of these three first results here, relative to other places on the page. That would be kind of a way to interpret this.
Okay.
Something else that's kind of interesting is this exhibits somewhat of what is known as like the F pattern in
F pattern?
Yeah.
Okay.
In how people view web pages online, where they can look along the kind of left side of these things, and up towards the top they will read a couple or look at a couple things kind of across horizontally. And you'll see that in some of these other examples here as well. It's a very common pattern.
So this is in English, right? Or in languages that read left to right. So do you think that if languages that started reading right to left, that would be like an inverse F? Because it would start here and go that way?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about how it's going to work with language versus images versus just how people are generally used to using the internet.
Right.
So there's kind of all these things that come into play, but it may well be the case that it's different given a different type of language here.
Okay, cool. And then just one more question. When you talk about fixations, right? What is a fixation? Could you tell us?
Yeah. So, I think a basic definition of a fixation. Our eyes are doing stuff all the time. Here,
right.
Always moving.
Right.
And when people are fixating on a certain point, you can kind of think of it as like
a pause,
more of a pause or like an enduring focus. Not necessarily doesn't necessarily have to be like that long.
Okay.
But I would keep the simple definition as kind of like a look.
A look.
Like they looked at that.
They looked at it. Okay. So it doesn't have to be a long look. It's just as long as their attention went there, that's a fixation.
Yeah.
Because in cognition, right, in cognitive psychology, when we talk about visual attention and we have like saccades and fixations are more prolonged, pauses. So that's sort of a difference, but the idea stays the same. Super interesting. Okay. So going back to, you mentioned that eye tracking is useful for things that are brief, tasks that are brief. What are some of the challenges of using an eye tracker?
Sure. So you certainly could use eye tracking for longer tasks.
Mm-hmm.
The trickiness then becomes things like making sure that the system is still calibrated so that the data it's giving you are accurate.
Okay.
And also that the participant or the individual wearing this, in this case, a mobile eye tracker, is actually focused on the task
Okay.
at hand. Right?
Oh, that's why you got to keep it brief because
There's going to be you can start to introduce more and more noise as time goes on.
Uh-huh.
You certainly could do something. The process for cleaning the data is going to probably take a bit more time and a bit more effort.
Got it.
And it's going to be probably more useful to you to have a shorter, more defined task to be able to analyze what those individual points are, kind of like on the way to a certain goal.
Okay, cool. And then what are the benefits of an eye tracker? Yeah,
so I'd say one of the benefits of an eye tracker is kind of how you put before, is like you really get to put yourself in the head of someone else. So when you're, for example, developing software, right, you are very familiar with this thing. You know how to use it. You very much understand how it works, and just bringing users into a lab, you can see people have certain issues using the thing.
Right.
Maybe you're doing some usability testing.
Yeah.
But in some cases, it's still not far enough. The participants might not be able to tell you exactly why they encountered an issue or what got them to the point where they actually encountered an issue. And with eye tracking, it gets you, I think, one step closer to that. You can actually see where they looked at, right, and things that they may have missed or may have seen before getting to a certain issue.
Right, and part of the reason, or part of the issue with user studies in general, is that they're very subjective, right? But I feel like with this data, you get really objective results because you can see exactly where they looked. That's really interesting. So I just have another question in terms of how do you determine whether or not you should use an eye tracker or not? Like, as a researcher, right, and working in industry, do you get to choose and say, I think that your study requires an eye tracker? Or do people come to you like, hey, Chris, this is so cool, I really want to use an eye tracker, and you're like, this is a survey question, not for eye tracking, for example,
I think that's actually a very good question. And I think the answer that you'll typically get from a researcher is that it depends on the question being asked. You want to make sure that the question being asked is one that's appropriate for eye tracking. Is this question asking about how users visually navigate a page?
Right. Okay. That's a good question. Yep. So when it's related to navigation of the interface, as you mentioned, that's a good eye tracking question.
That would be one example. Okay. If it's more of a question about maybe like user preferences, maybe a survey would be a different case there.
Got it. Super. And then I have to ask, this is like pretty cool looking. So is it like a one size fits all?
So for this set, there are different sized nose guards.
Nose guards.
Yes.
So even if you have a big nose or a small nose, you can still wear them. Awesome. Okay.
Yep.
Wait, really? Like you can adjust the size of that? That's fascinating.
So you can pop these off. This really quickly here. And put on perhaps a different size if a person has a broader or a narrower nose ridge.
Okay, super. And so how much does something like this actually cost?
Eye trackers can range in expense. You can go and check out some of the websites the companies have, but they do get to be quite pricey.
Okay, got it. So it's not, I can't put it even in my own password. So it they're probably sparse, right? In particular research settings, you don't have as many eye trackers as you would computers laying around, probably, right?
Yeah, that's
and
right.
then do you have to go through some sort of certification process or training, or does it depend on the company? Can I go out in the store, buy an eye tracker, and be like, hey, I'm ready to use it?
Sure. I think anybody could purchase one. I would not recommend necessarily using one without doing some sort of training or really understanding how that's used as a method. I think a lot of people actually learn methods like this in college or graduate school. Or something.
Is that how you learned about it?
No, I actually learned about it here.
Okay.
From other people who had learned about it and
I see.
really focused their academic careers on eye tracking.
Super interesting. And I just have one more question. We were talking a lot about data and things like that. Does eye tracking pertain to quantitative or qualitative testing?
You know, I think that's also another good question.
I'm full of good questions today.
I think there are uses for the data in both ways.
Okay.
I'd say, you know, the majority of the use of the data are quantitative in nature.
Mm-hmm.
People run statistical analyses, determining, you know, whether people are looking at one area of interest versus another area of interest more often. These types of things.
But sorry, can I, before you go to the qualitative, so they're considering data for statistical analyses, which is numeric, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how does the heat map, or how does the data that you collect from where people are looking, what form of measurement is that? Like, is that time in seconds? Is it like nanosecond? Like, what is the unit of measurement typically used in the eye tracking software?
Sure. So again, this is where you can get all sorts of metrics.
Yeah.
One of the examples that we saw on the heat map was fixations. In that case, I think we were thinking it was probably like number of fixations.
Okay, so it's just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's
sure.
Okay, got it.
So number of fixations would be one you could use. Fixation duration could be another one you might use.
Okay.
There are all sorts of metrics here depending on the question that you want to answer.
Okay. That helps. Okay, sorry, and then I cut you off when you were going to explain how the eye tracker is used for qualitative research.
So I think with this particular set, you know, because you do have that video feed from the front, this is something you can also use to kind of more qualitatively describe what the participant is doing, and actually be able to put, you know, other kind of people in the head of this person who is undergoing some study.
Got it. Okay, so when it's something about what they're seeing and it's more of like a stream of consciousness and they're telling you this or that, then that's more qualitative. But then whatever is imported into the software and any statistical analyses, that's the quantitative part of it. That's awesome. That's really fascinating. I know we have a lot of methods in UX research, and they're very like split between qualitative and quantitative. So this is a really awesome way to hybrid the two of them.
Yeah.
Right. So. Awesome. Well, that was really fascinating. Thank you, Chris, for sharing all of your eye tracking knowledge with us. I hope you all enjoyed that, and please send us any questions in the future if you want to see more of Chris. Thanks, everyone.